Guys, one of our earlier lessons provided us with a glimpse of what pivot tables are and how they function. We learned that pivot tables are Excel's dynamic and interactive tables and are a preferred tool for a number of Excel users. But why is it that so many people enjoy working with them? Well, for starters, pivot tables are capable of summarizing thousands of rows of data in just a few seconds. All we have to do is drag and drop, and we can create the report that we need. No functions are needed when we use pivot tables, which makes them popular among a large number of users. Furthermore, pivot tables are very efficient when the file we are working with exceeds 20 megabytes. Of course, working exclusively with pivot tables has some slight drawbacks. For example, other users won't be able to see how you came up with final numbers. If you work with formulas, your colleagues won't see what stays behind a given number in your reports. Another problem is that pivot tables do not update automatically when the source data is updated. This can be an issue if we want to use them for the purposes of financial modeling. However, even if they have a few cons, pivot tables are definitely one of the top instruments in Microsoft Excel. In the following lessons of this chapter, we will see how they can be applied in practice in order to elaborate large data extractions. The task that we are going to undertake in this lesson is to create a pivot table. This is fairly easy to do once we know what type of final output we would like to obtain. In front of you is the database that contains all of the information that we want to include in our report. These are various transactions that a firm registered. We can see detailed information about each of the transactions: year, store type, product group, producer company, code, volume, cost of the product, and revenue for the product. We already know what to do when creating a pivot table, right? We have to select the entire table, click on the Insert tab, and then select Pivot Table. The dialog box that appears shows us that we are about to create a pivot table for the cells that we have selected, which is exactly what we want to do. We can select whether to insert the pivot table into our existing sheet or into a new worksheet. Let's leave the settings as we see them and create the pivot table in a new sheet. I'll click OK. This is where we will create our pivot table. On the right side of the screen, we have all the pivot table fields. Each of the fields corresponds to the data that we have in one of the columns of our database. In order to create a report, we need to drag and drop these fields into the 4 areas below. Let's say that we would like to create the following report: amount of volume sold by each type of store in each of the years that we have in our table. We need to include 3 parameters: volume, type of store, or simply type, and year. I'll drag the type field in the rows area because I would like for each of the rows of the table to show information for a specific type of store. Then I'll drag the year field in the columns area, as we need to see a split for each of the periods that are contained in the database. And finally, I'll add the volume field within the values area, as these are the values that we would like to observe. There is one slight complication, though. Right now, our table does not display the volumes that were sold in each store, but rather it counts the number of cells in which there is a value for volumes. In order to change that, we need to click on the parameter and select Value Field Settings. Here we can choose the type of calculation that will be carried out when Excel summarizes our data into a pivot table. We have to select Sum. All right, let's click OK. The pivot table should be fine now. It displays the volume that was sold in each of the types of stores throughout the periods that are contained in the database. This was very easy and efficient, right? In our next lesson, we'll focus on formatting pivot tables and enhancing their appearance. Thanks for watching. You already know how to create a pivot table. In this lesson, we will learn how to format the table that we created. I'll click on one of the cells of the table, and as you can see, two additional tabs appear in the ribbon. One of them is called Analyze, and the other is Design. Given that we want to modify the table's appearance, we'll select the Design tab. Okay, the Design tab does not contain many options, but here's what we can do with it. We can select a predetermined pivot table style from here. I simply have to click on the style of my choosing, and the pivot table will instantly change its colors and borders according to the style that we've chosen. The layout functions that we have on the left side allow us to choose whether we want to see subtotals or grand totals. We can choose the type of report layout that we want to have, and whether to include blank lines within our pivot table. Right, so this is pretty much what we can do with the Design tab. What is more important to remember is that the appearance of your pivot tables can be modified exactly like the appearance of any other table in Excel. We can change its font, its font size, the colors of its rows, the color of its total row, insert borders from the Format Cells menu, and so on. So yeah, you can shape your pivot tables any way you like. Thanks for watching. Here's the pivot table that we created earlier. Now it's nicely formatted. Let's show a few additional techniques you can use in the future when creating pivot tables. If, at some point, the numbers that served as a source for our pivot table change, this wouldn't affect it, and it will continue to display the same figures that it showed when it was created. Pivot tables do not update automatically when their source is updated. This is something that we have to bear in mind every time when we decide to use them. In order to update a pivot table, we have to use the Refresh button that we can see when we right-click on the pivot table. After we click Refresh, the table will update and will start reflecting the changes that were made to its source. All right, having said that, let's look at our pivot table. It provides a breakdown of the volumes that were achieved in the three types of stores. What if we wanted to see some additional information? For example, we could be interested in seeing volumes and revenues for 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014. So I'll drag the revenue field and place it in the values area. As you can see, the pivot table was immediately updated. And now it contains volumes and revenues for 4 years. If I would like to see revenues first, I will simply place them above the volume field in the values area, and the pivot table will be updated. This is how we can arrange items within pivot tables. The title row of the table looks a little odd right now, doesn't it? It reads Sum of Revenue and Sum of Volume. If we want to change the names, we can do it by selecting one of the cells that contain the title name, right-clicking on it, and then selecting Value Field Settings. And here, we can customize the name of the top row of the table. In this case, I'll change it to Sales. And voila! The name was updated for the entire table. We can do the same thing for volumes. I'll select the cell, right-click on it, Then click on Value Field Settings, where I can type a new name. All right, perfect. Our database table contains lots of information. It shows the type of store where a product was sold, a product group category, the firm that produced the product, and so on. What if we wanted to have a pivot table that includes an additional degree of breakdown? Currently, the pivot table contains a breakdown of sales and volumes that were obtained in the various types of stores. And in case we wanted to see which product groups were sold the most, we can simply select the product group field, drag it in the rows area, and place it below type. And now the table shows the product groups that were sold in each of the store types. If I change the order of the two parameters, the table will adjust accordingly. The leading parameter becomes product group, and then within it we have a split of store type. The table was kind of nicer before we made this change, right? Let's reverse it. Okay, this will do it. In our next lesson, we will learn about the getPivotData function and why it is an important one. Thanks for watching. Links that you create with the cells of a pivot table are different than the links you'll normally have when linking to regular cells in Excel. Let's see why. If I link to the data that we have on the right, I'll get a regular cell reference, right? Okay, now I'll do the same thing, linking to one of the cells of the pivot table that we have on the left. As you can see, the reference is significantly different. It is a function, the getPivotData function. This is how Excel extracts numbers from a pivot table. It uses getPivotData. Can you think of a possible reason we need a function to link to the data that is contained in a pivot table? Here's a hint. The pivot table we have here will change its dimensions if we modify the parameters that are selected. For example, I can deselect volumes, and the table will reduce its size. Hence, the original reference will change its location. Nevertheless, getPivotData continues to show the original link we created. A lot of Excel users stop here and think this is pretty much all that getPivotData does. But that's not necessarily true. Let's look at the function in detail. We created a link to the sales figure of cornflakes in convenience stores that was observed in 2014. The function contains several arguments. The first one is sales, and this is the field we are looking at. We created a link with sales data. Then the next argument is called pivot table, and it's linked to the cell A3, which is the upper left cell of the table, the first cell of the pivot table. It basically shows we are extracting data from the given pivot table. The next arguments that we will see will tell Excel which piece of data needs to be extracted. Field 1 and Item 1 specify that we linked to 2014. Field 2 and Item 2 indicate that we are interested in obtaining information about convenience stores, while Field 3 and Item 3 narrow the list by pointing to a specific product group, cornflakes. As a result, we obtain the number that satisfies all of these criteria. Perfect. But what if we substitute the hard links within the function with references to an external table? Is the getPivotData function going to work? Yes, it is. I'll type 2014 in the cell above our function and substitute the hard number we have inside getPivotData with a reference. As you can see, that's completely fine for Excel, and it still displays a result. This is where things get very interesting. In one of our next lessons, we'll show you how to use pivot tables and getPivotData to their fullest. This is it for now. Thanks for watching. Right, we are making excellent progress. We learned how to create, manipulate, format, refresh, and adjust pivot tables. In addition, we became familiar with the getPivotData function. In this lesson, we will introduce a functionality that became available with Excel 2010, slicers. And of course, slicers are also available in Excel 2013 and Excel 2016. Slicers are pivot table filters that allow you to quickly and easily select the type of data you want to see from your pivot table. Slicers provide buttons you can click to filter pivot table data. In addition to quick filtering, slicers also indicate the current filtering state, which makes it easy to understand exactly what is shown in a filtered pivot table report. Let's provide an example. Here's the pivot table we created earlier. I'll select it, then click on the Insert tab. Here we can see the Slicer button, which is within the Filters section. OK, after we click on it, a dialog box appears. It asks us to select the fields for which we will create slicers. For example, I'll select Year and Product Group. Let's click OK, and we'll obtain our two slicers. Slicers are very easy to use. I can click on one of these buttons, and the pivot table will be immediately filtered according to the year I've selected. See? If I want to make multiple selections, I can click on this button right here, and then select the buttons of my choosing. Then, if I would like to remove the filter, I can either select all of the buttons manually or click on the Clear Filter button that we have right here. Once we click on it, the pivot table will start displaying all financial periods that are included in its data source. If we would like to change the name of the slicer that we've created, we can right-click on it, select Slicer Settings, and type the new name here. The Slicer Settings dialog box provides some additional sorting and filtering options. For example, we can choose to hide the slicer's heading by deselecting this checkbox. All right, perfect. The Slicer Tools tab that appears in the ribbon when we select a slicer contains some useful commands. Here we can adjust the dimensions of the buttons and of the slicer's frame by using the commands that stand on the right side of the tab. The Slicer Styles section would allow us to select from a list of predefined format styles, or create our own custom style. If we want to create a new formatting style, we will have to click on this button here and choose New Slicer Style, where we can format how to see the various slicer elements. Once we create the new style, we'll be able to see it among the predefined slicer styles. This was our introduction to slicers. In one of our next lessons, we'll provide an example of how slicers can be used in practice to create a good-looking and interactive report. Thanks for watching.